I'm Shane Morris with the Coulson Center for Christian Worldview. What's the secret sauce for saving marriages? The church. Today on the BreakPoint Podcast, John Stonestreet talks with DeGance of Communio, a ministry that brings churches together to identify and help couples in crisis. Communio's data-driven, church-centered approach has achieved stunning results in Jacksonville, Florida, where the divorce rate plummeted 24% in just 3 years, and their approach will be spreading to other cities around the country. Here are John Stonestreet and DeGance.
So we've been talking about for years at the Coulson Center. In fact, not just me, certainly Chuck Coulson talked about for years that one of the most significant developments in any society is what happens with marriage, and that in Western culture, in America in particular, there's no way to avoid the consequences of the breakdown of the family. As Dallas Willard once said, you can't step off the roof and then choose not to hit the ground. Welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast, John Stonestreet. I want to have a conversation with someone who's, I don't want to say figured out the secret sauce, JP. I don't know if you'd be willing to quite say that you know now the secret sauce of fixing marriage in America, but a headline caught my eye and it reminded me of a conversation that you and I needed to have. I met JP, who is the CEO of an organization called Communio. Did I say that right? Communio? Is that the way to say it?
You did.
Nice.
That'll work.
That'll work.
That's the way we say it. We don't say, I guess the official Latin pronunciation is a little bit different, so if your listeners are very used to
classically homeschooled, they'll know it.
Exactly.
Yeah. My daughters probably
people
are going to correct me since they know somewhat of Latin. But you and I met several months ago, and you were talking about kind of these remarkable things that you had seen in the city of Jacksonville. And then a World Magazine article, which dates, let's see, when did that hit? Yeah, beginning of November, and we'll link to that at breakpoint.org, was titled Fixing the Marriage Crisis. And there's a picture of you, and I'm like, I know that guy, and we need to have this conversation. So here's the headline. What if you could fix the collapse of marriage, or you could dramatically curtail it? And what if the answer doesn't come from the government? What if it comes from outside the government? And what if you could actually see a divorce rate drop, and this is what I'm quoting, in 2 years, 24%. I mean, that's an astonishing thing. That's what you're saying has happened in Jacksonville, Florida. JP DeGance, it's great to have you on the BreakPoint Podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Well, John, excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So talk me through this, because one of the things that the immediate thing that I saw when I saw this stat, a divorce rate drops 24% in just 2 years in Jacksonville, Florida, is, well, look, the divorce rate is already dropping across America, and that's not actually good news.
Yep.
It's because fewer people are getting married, so there's fewer divorces. But when we talk about actually a percentage, we're still talking about, of all the overall marriages, an extremely high number are failing, and so much so that people have stopped trusting marriage. So tell me what this 24% actually means.
Yeah, and actually it was 24% decline. That the final study showed that the report is citing is 24% over the full 3-year testing period, and it was a drop that would be the equivalent drop in 3 years of percentage-wise, as you noted, that the divorce rate overall is on decline, but it was almost about 20 years worth of divorce decline in about 3 years. So it was statistically
significant,
very significant. In fact, the one of the scholars on the project said, "Look, I get hired." I'm paraphrasing him, Spencer James. He said, "I've been hired to do studies and evaluations on a lot of community-wide initiatives, and I can usually slap them down really easily as not having an effect. And I just couldn't do that with this. The numbers were just too stark and too startling. Obviously, within the realm of social science, any academics listening to this would know that there's a lot of evidence that we were the cause, and we believe it's causal. And the scholars say, yeah, there's a lot of reason to believe it was causal. But proving causality is next to impossible unless you have a randomized control trial. But we feel really good that the intervention that we did was so significant and such a sharp decline that and they could not find any other demographic explanation that would have explained such an unrealistic loss. To put it in another sense, Jacksonville had never been below the state average divorce rate in the state of Florida since the advent of no-fault divorce. And in the second year of the initiative, it went below that state average and became the lowest divorce rate county of all large counties in the state of Florida. So it was, by any measure, a huge decline.
One of the things that I loved about this, even when you and I talked about it in person, and then when I saw this report, is it's a real John 17 sort of effort in the sense, in that high priestly prayer, Jesus really prays for unity, and that people would actually work together. And that's one of the things that I think we can all say is, look, there's not a shortage of good content about marriage, about weekends, conferences, intensives, training. We know kind of what makes a good marriage and what doesn't. It's always been kind of a mystery. We have all of this wonderful content on marriage, and it doesn't seem that we're actually penetrating the culture. And you brought together an incredible network. I mean, so when you say Communio did this, it really what you did is you curated it, you catalyzed it by bringing together so many churches, so many Christian organizations, so many different ministries, so many different initiatives, and put them together and then deployed them. So talk about kind of what the vision is and what does it actually look like on the ground that made this dramatic difference?
Well, thanks, John. A big thing I always tell pastors when we meet with them is we've paid a lot of tuition, okay, and we've paid some dumb taxes along the way. This project started as an experimental project with a diverse group of funders trying to figure out what would work to boost family stability and increase regular church attendance on a large scale, citywide scale. And we just had some baseline assumptions. The big assumption was that ultimately life changes through personal relationships. Okay, that's the most effective way to do that. So we knew we wanted to scale the number of life-changing relationships in Duval County. The initial push, we thought, was let's incentivize all of these awesome content generators to go into the market to distribute their phenomenal programs. And it was that early stage we realized that was a high-cost mistake because you ended up saturating the market. And pastors know that there's a lot of mousetraps out there to save any number of issues, and marriage being one of them. And we made a big pivot. I had worked in the public policy world, was very familiar with predictive analytics and the use of really high-quality market research. We did a gap analysis when we got started and started to realize, the gap wasn't, as you just noted, phenomenal content. There's enough content to save the world. It's usually sitting on the bookshelves of pastors everywhere. The question is, how do you make it catalytic? And so we sat down with a pastor of a large church, and he allowed us to match his membership with some of the predictive analytics that we had created. And one of those predictive analytics was we actually modeled the behavior of divorce. We looked at about 30,000 people who had recently been divorced nationwide, and then looked at all of the consumer spending habits of those folks, used that to create a model, and looked at all the married people in our cities in Jacksonville and said, who looks like these people who recently got divorced? And then we were able to show that pastor that 24% of his congregation fit a highly predictive model for divorce. And that was game-changing because now we weren't leading with content. We were leading with a diagnostic. We were able to show the pastor that there's a problem right here. And then the excitement, the enthusiasm, the passion of the church was unleashed on solving the problem. And then we could consult with that church and give them guidance on what content maybe they should use. We now work with 32 different content authors, Catholic, evangelical, some secular stuff that's out there. And depending on the church and the context, there's a lot of different tools in the toolbox. When all you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. And we don't need to always use a hammer. There's a lot of different tools that a church can use.
There's so much to unravel here. Hold on a second. So maybe back up. The first thing is, so a pastor of a large church just discovers 24% of the marriages in his congregation are in trouble. Is that what you just said?
Yeah, that's exactly
well.
What
First of all, did you have to get him up off the floor? I mean, maybe enough pastors know this instinctively. Was he surprised?
Yes, he was. But you know what was so awesome about this pastor? He said, I had been having problems in my marriage about 5 years ago. Nobody knows about it, and I just thought I was alone. And now I'm realizing this is a problem throughout the church. And so this was July of 2016. he threw out his preaching calendar for the fall, and which, for a church of 10,000 plus, that's to just scrap the fall preaching calendar in July is a hard thing to do. And he said, I want to make my church the center for healthy relationships. And he pulled in some content we recommended. It was Reengage out of Watermark Church in Dallas. And he did a 6-week sermon series on relationships and forgiveness and made it the centerpiece of that fall. And once the problem, it's one thing to know the problem in the abstract. Before we had that data, we chat with them and say, our same guy went to the pastor and said, look, pastor, we got to do something about marriage. It's really important. Will you work with us? He said, I know marriage is really important. I got a to-do list. I got 12 things on it. It's maybe number 11 on the list. I'll get to it at some point, not this year. Once he realized it was a real problem in his own congregation, he wanted to take action. So our entire model now is what we call a data-informed full circle relationship.
Well, that's the other thing, JP, that I want to bring up, because as you're explaining this, some people who have the big data sniff test just probably, their heads just exploded, because we hear about big data only being used for, evil and for marketing stuff to us that we don't want. And there's probably a level of discomfort, that some people have, like, okay, so this is another big data play, but it's being done for a redemptive purpose. But kind of describe where does this information and data come from, and how are you putting it together? And I mean, that's an interesting thing. So you looked at the behaviors of recently divorced people, found 24% of marriages in one single congregation that was mimicking that behavior. I mean, is this a pretty accurate, predictive data set?
We found it. Yeah. What we've done is we've added to our tools now. When we work with a church, we begin with what we call a first-party assessment, which is a survey of the congregation that they answer a question that's designed by a scholar out of the University of Denver, Dr. Scott Stanley, and it helps us understand the relationship quality of everybody in the congregation. There's a design for singles and there's a design for marrieds. And what we find is the way he's designed the question is how you answer it is highly predictive of whether or not you're trending toward divorce. So what we've done is now been running these assessments, and then so we worked with the church in Philadelphia or at Conshohocken recently, and 15% of the congregation self-reported they were struggling in their marriage, which meant the way they answered the question, they were trending toward divorce. In the consumer products data, it was 17%. So those numbers were really close. We did that with the largest church in Pennsylvania, largest evangelical church in Pennsylvania. That other church was 24% self-reported, struggling and in the first-party assessment. And the model data was, I believe, 23%. So those numbers are matching up between the survey and the model, which is just reconfirming to us that the data is good from a modeling perspective, because when you ask them the question, they're answering it in the way, at least in the aggregate, the report is mirroring the model. So we know that there's a lot of, now you asked a big question there at the beginning. You hear about all this scary stuff about big data. This is a good thing. We always tell churches, we did not invent predictive analytics. Okay, this has been around for 20 or so years. In some way, shape, or form, it's used by the financial services industry. It's used by political parties. It's used by large companies, and it's been used to sell things that are both good and not so good. And so the question has been, we argued, is does the church engage with these 21st century tools to try to build the kingdom, or do we continue to allow the world to use it frequently in ways that are undermining faith and undermining the norms that give rise to a full embrace of the gospel?
Shane Morris here again. We'll get back to John Stonestreet and JP DeGance in just a moment. At the Coulson Center, we often hear from BreakPoint listeners about the impact our commentaries and podcasts have on their lives. One BreakPoint listener named Rebecca recently told us this: I've always enjoyed learning more about worldview and how to live my Christian faith in light of a variety of challenging issues. However, in the past couple of years, the Coulson Center's work has become more than just enjoyable for me. It's become faith-saving. If BreakPoint has impacted you anywhere near the way it has Rebecca, please take the opportunity to join thousands of others expressing their gratitude in advance of Giving Tuesday, which is tomorrow, December 3rd. You can give online at breakpoint.org/podcast. Thank you. Now back to John Stonestreet and JP DeGance.
So one of the things, and there's another article in addition to the World Magazine article that we'll link to at breakpoint.org. Just come to the homepage there and click on the link that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. But there was an article, an interview that you did with Alyssa Elledge at IFS, the Institute for Family Studies. And one of the things that comes out in that is that initially when you guys targeted Jacksonville, you had other cities as well that you were gonna you were gonna target. Dayton, Ohio, Phoenix, Arizona. And then, of course, Jacksonville. It didn't go as well in Dayton and Phoenix. And so I think, again, I feel like I'm pushing back on you a lot, but I think this is so interesting. Is this replicable in other cities, and what went wrong in Dayton and Phoenix as you're trying to take this to other cities?
So Dayton first, I'll go in order here. So a key metric we were trying to track is a cost per person served in a city. And the first year was the most expensive across all three of the cities. Jacksonville came out higher than we wanted. It was about $300 a person to get a person through a 4-hour or longer ministry program around couples relationship education. Okay, in Dayton, the cost was nearly $1,800 a person after year one, and we just decided that we couldn't get distribution through our local partner there at a level that was cost effective. And so what we decided was, after year one, we essentially ended 95% of our activity in the Dayton market, so that we could keep refining in Jacksonville and Phoenix. In Phoenix is 5 times the size of Jacksonville, and we only had about twice the spending in Phoenix, and we never got to the distribution level that was proportionate to what we did in Jacksonville. The other thing that was different between the two markets was we had a phenomenal local partner in Live the Life Ministries. I can't thank them enough. Richard Albertson's the president of the organization. They were our anchor partner. We did not roll in with the Communio brand. At the time, we were a project of the Philanthropy Roundtable, and we didn't want to use that brand. So Live the Life was both on-the-ground experts and had relationships in the community. And the leaders of that organization laser focused on divorce. We actually originally had 4 measures that each local partner was allowed to track and go after, which was increasing marriages, decreasing out of wedlock birth, decreasing divorce, and increasing church attendance. And Richard and their board chairman, Dennis Stoica, just said, let's just focus on divorce. And then in Phoenix, our local partner there actually ended up having programs that went into some diverse areas. There was some elements as it related to divorce prevention, marital enrichment, but there were other elements on parenting. There was other elements on out of wedlock. So what we ended up having in Phoenix was proportionally much lower distribution, proportion to the population. The per capita distribution was far lower than Jacksonville. And then the programmatic focus was nowhere near what it was focused on in Jacksonville. So it was really spread out. So those were from our perspective, we realized that, focusing on relationship ministry with zeroing in on marital enrichment is key. If that's the outcome you're looking to get, and then the market share needs to be sizable if you're going to get significant movement in the demographic outcomes in the city.
Yeah, I can kind of hear 2 equal and opposite responses to that level of kind of business planning and detail. I mean, one would be, I think, a group of people who are really asking that question. I think especially at this time of year, as we head to the end of the calendar year and your mailbox gets flooded with so many people asking you for money to support their good cause, is this cause effective? And the level of detail that you have brought to this, JP, is really, I think, quite impressive. On the other hand, you can kind of hear a whole group of people saying, why are they spending so much time and energy on that? Let's just love people. And there is a difference between helping people with your heart alone and helping people with your heart and your head, right? Bringing kind of good ideas and good thoughts to bear on this and really trying to move the needle for an entire community. I mean, this is cultural engagement at a level, that we don't usually see.
That's such a great duality there to point out. I think a lot of times those of us who really seek earnestly to know and love Jesus sometimes will forget that all of the talents that we have are not our talents, right? The parable of the talents, the key is they're the master's talents. There's an onus on us to use these talents, these treasures that our Lord has given us very well. And so when funders give us resources, we can't just, and we certainly shouldn't just say, essentially, shucks, I'm doing the best I can because I'm a Christ follower. We need to we owe it to our Lord to use those precious talents and be good stewards of what God has given us. And I think having a focus on measurement and having a focus, on trying to produce outcomes is a good thing and is a good way to be a good steward of those gifts that God has given us.
Given what you learned from Dayton, Ohio, and from Phoenix and from Jacksonville, are you confident now that you've kind of, how'd you put it, pay the dumb tax enough that you're ready to scale it and you know what success will look like and what the key ingredients are? And maybe just give us, what are those key ingredients for this kind of citywide successful marriage triage? What are the ingredients that are necessary for it?
Yes, we do think that we've identified a replicable strategy, and we've begun the work of replicating our efforts. There'll be 4 new cities starting work. We've got 2 started already in Billings, Montana, and the Permian Basin, Midland and Odessa, and then 2 very large markets that we'll be announcing in the coming weeks that'll be starting. The key is there's a lot of energy that goes into citywide projects that are focused on convening, and we think that's a mistake. The unit of change is the church, okay? And so another key is aligning the tools with the church with their self-interest of advancing the gospel, okay? And when you do that, you can actually catalyze a lot of churches to work on their own to solve a big problem in their community, so that ultimately everybody is working alone together, if that makes sense. That First Baptist and St. Mary's Catholic Church and First Presbyterian don't have to have a meeting to coordinate. They're using common tools and common strategies to affect change in their congregation. And once you get that rolling, that is transformative. And then later on, they start to recognize, hey, we're doing things that are very similar, and then you can actually pull them together to compare notes, and they learn from that, and that's key. The other thing is sort of our playbook, which is what we call a data-informed full circle ministry, which is using data to diagnose problems, data to do outreach, and then applying best practices in relationship ministry for folks that are married, those who are single, those who are in crisis, and those who are preparing. If you do all that can all live under the church's roof and be an outreach ministry using data to pull people in from around the community to transform both the church and the world.
Well, and that brings up a second question, which is, and you mentioned this within your answer, which is that the church actually is a core part of the answer to this, right? It's a necessary ingredient. We had Rick Warren speak at our Wilberforce Weekend conference in last May, and one of the things that he addressed was there's not a more decentralized, accessible distribution channel in the world than the church. Is that kind of what you found in terms of dealing with this?
Yes.
I mean, the state can't really solve this problem, right? And who can? The church.
No, and you're absolutely right. And I think sometimes in our country, even those who are churchgoers can frequently make the same mistake of the world, which is there's a problem, then there ought to be a law, and the government ought to do something. That's not the way our nation was founded. That's not what de Tocqueville talked about in his Democracy in America. That there's a lot. Ultimately, the church can be that fulcrum that can move huge problems, and has historically. We saw that churches are sticky in ways that non-church private entities are not. And what I mean by that is there's people in the church passionate about forming real relationships, meaningful relationships. So if you go to your local church, there's people who are going to say hi. They're going to invite you over for dinner. They're going to become friends with you in ways that if you're, at a local secular nonprofit, it's just not the same. And there's a lack of stigma with going to a church for events and activities that doesn't necessarily connotate the same way if you're going to a marriage class at the local Y or Boys and Girls Club. It's just a different. You're not as likely to tell your friends about it. So the church is really a powerhouse, we believe, for cultural transformation.
Hey, last question here, and that is there's pastors that listen to this podcast, and they are passionate. I meet these guys. They want their church to make a difference. And I think many of them may be listening and saying, okay, well, we have a marriage program. We have a couples class. We do premarital counseling, maybe even do divorce intervention. What is it that they can do either to help partner around something community-wide or city-wide, or just even to take, my guess is most pastors would be like that first pastor we talked about. You mean 24% of if they knew that, if they had that data point, how can you help them? What can they do to join this, even if it's not part of one of your city projects?
Well, two things right off the bat. The first thing is to understand that a lot of churches think they may have something in this area. We did a study with Barna. 80% of evangelical churches reported spending 0% of their annual budget on marriage and relationship ministry. Just 28% of them had a substantive marriage ministry. So they do exist, but very few relative to the whole have this kind of focus. With that said, first thing is to know your people, right? Nehemiah wanted to know the city and tell me about the people, and we need to be able to do that. If you want, any pastor listening to this, we can get them a free report on their city and what's going on right around their community, and you can get a quick read on the number of marriages struggling, the number of cohabiting individuals without kids, with kids, the number of expectant parents in an area. A lot of times we tell churches there's 3 times people really look back in life and come back to church: hatch, match, and dispatch, right? So you got that birth. That birth phase is key, and you can invite expectant parents in at that point. So knowing that data on your communities is key. And any church, any pastor listening to this can get a free report from us if they email us at platform@communio.org. Our team will go ahead and get them a free report so they can start by just knowing what's going on within their community.
Say that email address one more time.
Platform@communio.org. So Communio is spelled C-O-M as in Mary, M as in Mary, U, N as in Nancy, I-O.org.
All right, and come to breakpoint.org. Click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll also link you to that email address as well as the Communio website and some of these articles that we mentioned about on today's program. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I tell you what, we don't celebrate enough wins. We feel like we're beleaguered in culture, and I just continually, when I hear stories like this, JP, as I come back to the fact that this is good news. The gospel is literally good news, and when you put it in place, it brings good things to the world. So again, my guest today on the BreakPoint Podcast has been the Communio CEO, JP DeGance. Is it DeGance or DeGance? I probably should have asked you that before we had this.
DeGance would be the proper French way, I think, but it's we pronounce it DeGance. Our name was originally DeGangi, which was a good Sicilian name, and then the French were way more popular in the late 1800s, so we went with DeGance.
It's something. Again, I'm new at this. This is something you should clear up as a podcast host, before you bring somebody on the show. But anyway, Communio CEO JP DeGance talking about an amazing success story out of Jacksonville, Florida, in which a bunch of churches and community groups got together and aimed at a problem, which was the divorce rate. Again, come to breakpoint.org, and we'll link you to some resources so you can find out more about this terrific program. JP, thanks so much for coming on the BreakPoint Podcast and telling us about this. It's really been fascinating.
Hey, thanks so much, John. Really appreciate you having me on.
You've been listening to John Stonestreet and JP DeGance of Communio. And just a reminder, Giving Tuesday, a globally recognized day of giving, is coming up tomorrow, December 3rd. But you don't have to wait to join thousands of other Christians giving to resource the movement of Christian believers who are living out a solid and biblical Christian worldview. You can give today at breakpoint.org/podcast. Thanks so much. For the Coulson Center, I'm Shane Morris, and thanks for listening.